Professor Zyx'nax slithered into the lecture hall, his gelatinous form undulating with barely contained excitement. Today was the day he'd been waiting for all semester, the day he'd introduce his class of bright-eyed, bright sensory appendaged alien medical students to the most fascinating, terrifying, and downright absurd species in the known universe, humans. As the last of the students oozed, floated, or otherwise propelled themselves into the room, Zyx'nax cleared his throat equivalent and began the lecture. All right, you lopnar-brained lot, settle down. Today we're going to dive into the medical curiosities of a species so bizarre, you'll think I'm making it up. But trust me, every word of this is true, and may the cosmic deities help us all. The students tittered nervously, a cacophony of clicks, whistles, and flatulent sounds filling the air. Zyx'nax waved a tentacle for silence, his amused gurgle echoing through the room. Now let's start with the basics. Humans are bipedal mammals from a little backwater planet called Earth. They're mostly harmless, mostly hairless, and mostly clueless about their place in the galactic community. But don't let their unassuming appearance fool you. These creatures are talking medical marvels that will make you question everything you thought you knew about biology. Zyx'nax paused for dramatic effect, enjoying the mix of confusion and anticipation on his students' faces, or whatever passed for faces in their respective species. First up, their immune system. You'd think a species that evolved on a planet teeming with microscopic killers would have developed some sort of impenetrable defense. Right? Wrong. Humans have an immune system that's about as reliable as a Zorgan bartender with the hiccups. The class erupted in laughter, with one student in the back row accidentally shooting a glob of acidic mucus onto their neighbor. Zyx'nax chuckled, continuing, their bodies are constantly at war with themselves, overreacting to harmless substances like pollen or peanuts, while completely missing the memo when it comes to actual threats. It's like their immune cells are a bunch of drunken security guards at a rowdy nightclub swinging wildly at shadows while the real troublemakers slip right past. A tentacled student in the front row raised an appendage. Professor, surely you jest? How could such a species survive? Zyx'nax's body rippled with mirth. Oh, my dear Blorptax, that's just the beginning. You see, humans have this charming little quirk called allergies. Imagine a defense system so paranoid, it decides that harmless tree spores are public enemy number one. Their bodies react by trying to expel the invaders through their respiratory and optical organs, resulting in a disgusting display of mucus and tears. It's like watching a malfunctioning waste disposal unit, fascinating and repulsive all at once. The class collectively shuddered, a few of the more sensitive students turning various shades of nausea. But wait, there's more, Zyx'nax exclaimed, his enthusiasm growing with each revelation. Let's talk about their digestive system. Now, you'd think a species would evolve to efficiently process the fuel it needs, right? Not humans. They've got this thing called an appendix, a useless little pouch that serves no purpose other than to occasionally explode and try to kill them. It's like having a self-destruct button installed in your body just for funsies. A crystalline being in the third row chimed in, its voice tinkling like wind chimes. Professor, that's preposterous. Surely they would have evolved past such a liability. Zyx'nax let out a sound that could only be described as a snort gurgle. Oh, my sweet summer crystal, if only it were that simple. You see, humans have this peculiar attachment to their evolutionary baggage. They cling to vestigial organs like a Flurbian clings to its last credit chip in a casino. But the appendix is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to their digestive oddities. The professor's form rippled with barely contained glee as he continued. Get this, humans can't even digest most of the plant matter they consume. They rely on symbiotic bacteria in their gut to do the heavy lifting. Essentially, they're talking fermentation tanks. And don't even get me started on their inability to synthesize certain essential nutrients. Vitamin C, nope, gotta eat that. B12. Better hope you're not a vegetarian, buddy. The class was a mix of horrified gasps and incredulous laughter. Zyx'nax was on a roll now, his gelatinous form quivering with excitement. But here's where it gets really wild, folks. Humans have this thing called lactose tolerance now. Most mammals on their planet stop producing the enzyme to digest milk after infancy. Makes sense, right? But a bunch of humans said, nah, we're gonna keep drinking the baby juice of other species well into adulthood. And you know what? Their bodies actually adapted to it. Can you imagine? It'd be like if we suddenly decided to start photosynthesizing for kicks. A gaseous entity in the back of the room expanded rapidly, its voice a hissing whisper. Professor, surely this can't be considered normal behavior for a sentient species. Zyx'nax's laughter filled the room, a sound like bubbles popping in a thick syrup. Oh, my dear whoosh, Cess, you haven't heard anything yet. Normal isn't a word that applies to humans. Let's move on to their reproductive system, shall we? Brace yourselves, because this is where it gets really weird. The class leaned in, a mix of morbid curiosity and trepidation palpable in the air. Humans reproduce sexually, which isn't unusual in itself. But get this, their reproductive cycle is completely out of whack with the rest of their biology. Females of the species have a monthly cycle where their bodies prepare for potential pregnancy, regardless of whether they're actually trying to conceive. And if they don't get pregnant, the body throws a tantrum and sheds the entire uterine lining. Every single month. A collective groan of disgust rippled through the classroom. Zyx'nax nodded sagely, his gelatinous form undulating with barely suppressed amusement. Oh, it gets better. During pregnancy, the human body basically becomes a battleground between the mother and the fetus. The placenta, that's the organ that connects the fetus to the uterine wall, is actually controlled by the fetus's genes. It burrows into the mother's tissues like some kind of parasitic invader, tapping directly into her bloodstream to siphon off nutrients. Meanwhile, the mother's immune system is frantically trying to fight off what it perceives as a foreign entity. A student with multiple eye stalks blinked rapidly in confusion. But Professor, how does the species survive if their own bodies treat reproduction as a hostile takeover? Zyx'nax chuckled, a sound like marbles rolling in molasses. Excellent question. The answer is, barely. Human pregnancy is a 9-month war of attrition that often leaves both parties worse for wear. And don't even get me started on the process of giving birth. Let's just say it involves pushing something the size of a grapefruit through an opening the size of a lemon, and leave it at that. The class collectively winced, with a few of the more squeamish students turning various shades of distress. But wait, there's more, Zyx'nax exclaimed, his enthusiasm growing with each revelation. Let's talk about the human brain. Now, you'd think a species capable of space travel would have a well-organized, efficient neural network, right? Wrong again. The human brain is like a junk drawer of evolution full of contradictions, shortcuts, and inexplicable quirks. The professor's form rippled with barely contained glee as he continued. For starters, humans have this thing called cognitive biases essentially. Their brains are hardwired to make irrational decisions based on faulty logic. They'll ignore overwhelming evidence if it contradicts their pre-existing beliefs. They'll throw good money after bad because they can't admit they made a mistake. And they'll convince themselves they're above average in nearly everything, despite obvious evidence to the contrary. A student with a bioluminescent cranium dimmed slightly in confusion. But Professor, how do they function in a complex society with such flawed reasoning? Zyx'nax let out a sound that could only be described as a snort gurgle. That's the beautiful irony of it all, my glowing friend. They don't just function, they thrive. Humans have this remarkable ability to be simultaneously brilliant and breathtakingly stupid. They can split the atom and still believe chocolate milk comes from brown cows. They can land on their moon and still fall for pyramid schemes. It's like their entire species is playing a cosmic game of 2 steps forward, 1 pratfall backward. The class erupted in a mixture of laughter and disbelief, with one student in the back accidentally activating their defense mechanism and spraying a foul-smelling mist over their neighbors. Oh, and let's not forget about sleep, Zyx'nax continued. Undeterred by the aromatic interruption, humans spend about 1/3 of their lives in a state of unconsciousness, lying horizontally and hallucinating vividly. They call it essential for survival, but honestly, it looks more like a system-wide glitch that they've just learned to work around. A crystalline being in the front row vibrated in confusion, its voice a tinkling chime. But Professor, surely such a vulnerable state would be evolutionarily disadvantageous. Zyx'nax's body rippled with mirth. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But humans have turned this bizarre shutdown into an art form. They've created entire industries around making their sleep more comfortable, special horizontal surfaces, coverings of various weights and textures, even devices to generate soothing noise. It's like they're trying to recreate the womb experience every single night. And don't even get me started on their sleep-related behaviors. The professor paused for dramatic effect, enjoying the mix of confusion and anticipation on his students' faces. Picture this: a human, lying unconscious, suddenly starts moving their optical organs rapidly beneath their lids. Their body becomes paralyzed, but their brain activity spikes. And here's the kicker: they start experiencing vivid hallucinations that they sometimes mistake for reality. They call it dreaming. And some of them believe these hormone-induced hallucinations hold deep meaning about their lives or even predict the future. The class burst into laughter, with one amorphous blob student laughing so hard it temporarily lost cohesion and had to be scooped back into its seat. But wait, there's more, Zyx'nax exclaimed, his gelatinous form quivering with excitement. Let's talk about human sensory perception. You'd think a species that prides itself on scientific advancement would have a reliable way of interpreting their environment, right? Wrong again. The professor's voice took on a tone of amused disbelief as he continued. Humans have this quaint little saying, seeing is believing. The irony is, their visual perception is about as reliable as a Zorgon's promise of sobriety. Their eyes are constantly lying to them, filling in gaps with made-up information and completely ignoring things that don't fit their expectations. A student with compound eyes clicked its mandibles in confusion. Professor, how can a species survive if they can't trust their own sensory input? Zyx'nax chuckled, a sound like bubbles popping in thick syrup. Oh, my dear, bzdist, click. That's the beauty of it. Humans don't just survive, they've built entire philosophies and legal systems based on the fallibility of their perceptions. They have a whole field of study dedicated to optical illusions, which is essentially the art of tricking their already untrustworthy eyes. It's like they're playing a constant game of, is this real, or am I just losing my mind? The class erupted in a cacophony of laughter, clicks, and wheezes. Zyx'nax waited for the noise to die down before continuing. And don't even get me started on their other senses. Their auditory system is so limited, they can only perceive a tiny fraction of the sound spectrum. Their olfactory capabilities are laughable compared to most other mammals on their planet. And their sense of touch. Let's just say it's a good thing they invented anesthesia, because their pain response is about as nuanced as a Blorvian mating call. A gelatinous student in the front row rippled with curiosity. But Professor, surely they must have some sensory advantages. Zyx'nax's form wobbled with barely contained mirth. Oh. They do have one party trick up their sleeve. They can detect the flavor of certain chemicals through their respiratory system after they've already swallowed them. They call it retronasal olfaction, but I like to think of it as taste the sequel. It's like their bodies said, you know what would be fun? If we could taste things twice. The class collectively groaned and chuckled, with a few students making notes in their various forms of record-keeping devices. Now let's move on to the human cardiovascular system. Zyx'nax continued, his enthusiasm undiminished. You'd think a species would evolve an efficient way to pump nutrients around their body, right? Well, humans decided to go with a single pump system that's about as reliable as a Gorgolian timeshare salesman. The professor's gelatinous form rippled with amusement as he elaborated. Their entire circulatory system depends on this one muscular organ they call a heart. It's basically a glorified meat pump that can decide to quit working at any moment. And the best part, this critical organ is protected by a flimsy cage of calcium sticks they call a rib cage. It's like keeping your most valuable possession in a container made of toothpicks. A student with multiple pulsating organs raised a tentacle. Professor, surely they have some sort of backup system. Zyx'nax let out a sound that could only be described as a liquid chuckle. Oh, my sweet summer polyp, you give them too much credit. Their idea of a backup system is to have slightly more heart tissue than they absolutely need. It's like having a spare tire that's already half flat. It might get you to the next service station, but I wouldn't count on it for a long journey. The class erupted in a mixture of horrified gasps and incredulous laughter. Zyx'nax was on a roll now, his gelatinous form quivering with barely contained glee. And don't even get me started on their blood vessels. They've got these things called arteries and veins, which are essentially just tubes held together by hope streams, and a thin layer of cells. One little nick, and suddenly they're leaking their precious bodily fluids all over the place. It's like their entire circulatory system is a game of don't spring a leak that lasts their entire lives. A crystalline being in the back row chimed in, its voice tinkling like wind chimes. But Professor, how do they manage complex physical tasks with such an unreliable system? Zyx'nax's laughter filled the room, a sound like bubbles popping in a thick syrup. Oh, my dear shimmering one. That's where it gets really interesting. You see, humans have this remarkable ability to push their bodies far beyond what should be physically possible. They call it adrenaline, but I like to think of it as their built-in override common sense button. The professor's form undulated with excitement as he continued. Picture this: a human is in a dangerous situation. Suddenly, their adrenal glands dump a cocktail of chemicals into their bloodstream. Their heart rate skyrockets, their pupils dilate, and they gain the temporary ability to perform feats of strength and endurance that should, by all rights, cause their flimsy bodies to simply fall apart. It's like they have a secret turbo mode that they can only access when they're about to die. The class leaned in, a mix of fascination and horror on their various face equivalents. But here's the kicker, Zyx'nax added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. This turbo mode comes with a catch. Once the danger has passed and the adrenaline wears off, humans often find themselves in a state they call crash. It's as if their bodies suddenly remember all the abuse they've just endured and decide to revolt in mass. Muscles ache, exhaustion sets in, and they're left wondering if they've been hit by a gargantuan space freighter. The professor's gelatinous form rippled with barely contained mirth as he continued. It's like their bodies are running an operating system with only two modes impending doom, and why did I do that? There's no in-between, no moderation. It's either lift this impossibly heavy object to save a life, or I think I'll just lie here on the floor and contemplate my poor life choices. A student with bioluminescent appendages pulsed with curiosity. Professor, surely such a system must have some evolutionary advantage. Zyx'nax's laughter filled the room, a sound like 1,000 tiny bubbles popping in synchronization. Oh, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But here's the real kicker: humans have found ways to deliberately trigger this response. For fun, the class collectively gasped, a cacophony of clicks, whistles, and surprised gurgles filling the air. That's right, my dear students, Zyx'nax continued, his voice dripping with amused disbelief. Humans participate in activities they call extreme sports or thrill-seeking. They deliberately put themselves in perceived danger to experience the rush of adrenaline. It's like they're playing a game of how close can I come to dying without actually shuffling off this mortal coil. A gaseous entity in the back row expanded rapidly in shock. But Professor, that's madness. Why would any sane species engage in such behavior? Zyx'nax's form wobbled with barely suppressed laughter. Ah, my dear whoosh sesh, you've just stumbled upon the eternal question that has puzzled xenobiologists for centuries. Are humans, in fact, sane? The jury's still out on that one. But let me tell you, their penchant for courting danger doesn't stop at extreme sports. The professor's voice took on a tone of mock seriousness as he continued. Oh no, humans have found myriad ways to trigger their fight or flight response. They consume beverages containing stimulants that mimic the effects of adrenaline. They watch horror movies that trick their brains into thinking they're in danger. Some even seek out spicy foods that literally cause pain and trigger a mild stress response. It's as if their entire species is engaged in a cosmic game of, let's see how much we can freak ourselves out today. The class erupted in a mixture of laughter and disbelief, with one amorphous blob student laughing so hard it temporarily lost cohesion and had to be scooped back into its seat. But wait, there's more, Zyx'nax exclaimed, his enthusiasm growing with each revelation. Let's talk about the human skeletal system. Now, you'd think a bipedal species would evolve a robust framework to support their upright posture, right? Well, think again. The professor's gelatinous form quivered with barely contained glee as he continued. Humans have this thing called a spine. It's essentially a stack of small bones with squishy discs in between, precariously balanced to support their entire upper body. It's like they're walking around on a poorly constructed Jenga tower that's one wrong move away from toppling over. A crystalline student in the front row vibrated in confusion. But professor, how do they maintain balance and mobility with such an unstable structure? Zyx'nax let out a sound that could only be described as a snort gurgle. That's the beauty of it, my transparent friend. They don't. Humans spend a significant portion of their lives dealing with back pain, herniated discs, and spinal misalignments. They've created entire industries dedicated to cracking, massaging, and realigning their spines. It's like they're constantly playing a game of Twister with their own skeletal system. The class burst into laughter, with several students needing to take a moment to regain their composure. And don't even get me started on their joints. Zyx'nax continued, his voice filled with amused disbelief. Humans have these things called knees, load-bearing joints that are essentially held together by rubber bands and optimism. One wrong twist, and suddenly, they're limping around like a Zorgon after a 3-day bender. A tentacled student in the back row raised an appendage. Professor, surely they must have some adaptations to compensate for these structural weaknesses. Zyx'nax's form rippled with mirth. Oh, they've adapted all right by inventing an endless array of braces, supports, and orthotics. Walk into any human medical supply store, and you'll find more joint support options than a Glegian has tentacles. It's like they're trying to hold their bodies together with sheer force of will and a lot of elastic bandages. The professor paused for a moment, letting the laughter die down before continuing. But here's where it gets really interesting, folks. Despite all these physical limitations, or perhaps because of them, humans have developed an astounding ability to adapt and overcome. They've turned their biological quirks into strengths, in ways that continue to baffle xenobiologists across the galaxy. Zyx'nax's voice took on a tone of grudging admiration as he elaborated. Take their endurance, for example. Humans might not be the fastest or the strongest species out there, but they can outlast almost anything on their planet in long-distance activities. They call it persistence hunting, and it's basically their way of saying, we may not catch you quickly, but we will follow you until you collapse from exhaustion. A student with multiple eye stalks blinked rapidly in confusion. But professor, how is that possible with their inefficient cardiovascular system and unstable skeletal structure? Zyx'nax chuckled, a sound like marbles rolling in molasses. Ah, therein lies the paradox of human physiology, my curious pupil. You see, humans have this remarkable ability to cool themselves through sweating. While most species on their planet have to stop and pant numb to avoid overheating, humans can just keep on trucking, leaving a trail of salty water in their wake. It's like they're mobile evaporative cooling units. The class collectively tilted their various sensory appendages in a universal gesture of intrigued bafflement. But that's not all. Zyx'nax continued, his gelatinous form quivering with excitement. Humans have turned some of their apparent weaknesses into incredible strengths. Take their hands, for instance. They lack claws or significant natural weapons, but the dexterity of their fingers allows them to manipulate objects with astonishing precision. They can create intricate art, perform delicate surgery, or type out entire novels using just their fingertips. It's like evolution looked at their ancestors and said, forget the claws, let's give them built-in precision tools instead. A gaseous entity in the back row expanded slightly in curiosity. Professor, are you suggesting that humans are advantageously designed? Zyx'nax's laughter filled the room, a sound like 1,000 tiny bells ringing underwater. Oh, my dear Wohi-sesh, designed is a strong word. It's more like humans are a hodgepodge of evolutionary compromises that somehow work together in astoundingly effective ways. They're the galactic equivalent of a machine cobbled together from spare parts that not only functions but occasionally outperforms top-of-the-line models. The professor's voice took on a tone of amused wonder as he continued. Consider their brains, for instance. We talked earlier about their cognitive biases and irrational behaviors, but the flip side of that coin is their incredible creativity and problem-solving abilities. Humans have this knack for looking at a problem from angles that would never occur to more logically minded species. It's like their mental quirks occasionally short-circuit into genius. A bioluminescent student pulsed with curiosity. Can you give us an example, Professor? Zyx'nax's form rippled with enthusiasm. Certainly. Take their approach to space travel. When humans first started exploring beyond their atmosphere, they didn't have the technology for sustained flight. So what did they do? They strapped themselves to giant tubes filled with explosive chemicals and essentially said, "Light it up and let's see what happens." It's the kind of solution that's so crazy, so utterly bonkers, that it loops right back around to brilliant. The class erupted in a mixture of shocked gasps and incredulous laughter. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, Zyx'nax continued, his voice filled with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Humans have this remarkable ability to turn their weaknesses into strengths, their limitations into opportunities. They can't fly. They build machines that can. They can't breathe underwater. They create equipment that allows them to explore the depths of their oceans. It's like they looked at the limitations of their biology and collectively said, "Challenge accepted." A crystalline being in the front row vibrated in confusion. But Professor, doesn't this reliance on external tools and technology make them vulnerable? Zyx'nax's form wobbled with barely suppressed mirth. Oh, my shimmering friend, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But here's the kicker: humans have become so adept at creating and using tools that they've essentially extended their physical capabilities far beyond their biological limitations. They've turned technology into a kind of external evolution, adapting to new environments and challenges at a pace that leaves natural selection in the dust. The professor's voice took on a tone of mock seriousness as he continued. In fact, some xenoanthropologists argue that we shouldn't consider humans as purely biological entities anymore. They suggest we should view human individuals as hybrid biotechnological systems, with their tools and technology forming an integral part of their extended phenotype. A tentacled student in the back row raised an appendage. Professor, are you saying that humans are cyborgs? Zyx'nax let out a sound that could only be described as a liquid chuckle. In a manner of speaking, yes, but don't go picturing chrome-plated beings with laser eyes just yet. Human cyborgization is much more subtle and much more pervasive than that. Think about it. Many humans rely on external devices to regulate their body's chemistry, enhance their sensory perception, or even control their reproductive cycles. They carry around portable computers that extend their memory and cognitive capabilities. Some even have mechanical devices implanted in their bodies to support or replace failing organs. The class collectively leaned in, a mix of fascination and horror on their various face equivalents. But here's where it gets really interesting, Zyx'nax continued, his gelatinous form quivering with excitement. Humans don't just use technology to compensate for their biological limitations, they use it to enhance their natural abilities in ways that blur the line between science and science fiction. They've created exoskeletons that allow them to lift enormous weights, developed brain-computer interfaces that let them control machines with their thoughts, and are even working on ways to directly augment their cognitive abilities. A student with multiple pulsating organs raised a tentacle. Professor, this sounds dangerously close to playing God. Surely there must be ethical concerns. Zyx'nax's form rippled with amusement. Oh, my sweet summer polyp, you've just stumbled upon one of the great paradoxes of human existence. You see, humans are constantly grappling with the ethical implications of their technological advancements. They create oversight committees, draft regulations, and engage in heated philosophical debates about the nature of humanity and the limits of scientific progress. And then, more often than not, they go ahead and do the thing anyway, figuring they'll sort out the ethical quandaries as they go along. The professor's voice took on a tone of amused disbelief as he continued. It's like they're engaged in a perpetual game of catch-up between their technological capabilities and their ethical frameworks. They'll clone a sheep and then spend the next decade arguing about whether they should have done it. They'll create artificial intelligence sophisticated enough to pass their Turing tests, and then panic about the implications for human uniqueness. It's a never-ending cycle of ooh, look what we can do, followed by oh no, should we have done that? The class erupted in a cacophony of laughter, clicks, and wheezes. Zyx'nax waited for the noise to die down before continuing. But you know what? That's part of what makes humans so fascinatingly resilient. They're not afraid to push boundaries, to explore the unknown, to challenge the very limits of their existence. Sure, they might stumble along the way, but they always pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and keep moving forward. Zyx'nax's voice softened slightly, taking on a tone of grudging respect. And that, my dear students, is perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from human physiology and psychology. Despite all their biological quirks, despite all their cognitive biases and irrational behaviors, despite all the ways in which their bodies seem almost comically ill-suited to their environment, humans have not just survived, they've thrived. The professor's gelatinous form seemed to straighten as much as a gelatinous form can as he delivered his closing remarks. They've spread across their planet, adapting to every conceivable environment. They've reached into space, set foot on their moon, and sent their machines to the farthest reaches of their solar system. They've peered into the depths of atoms and out to the edges of their observable universe. And they've done it all with bodies that by any rational standard should have relegated them to a footnote in the grand story of galactic evolution. Zyx'nax paused, letting his words sink in. The lecture hall was uncharacteristically quiet, each student lost in contemplation of the bizarre, brilliant, paradoxical species they'd spent the last few hours studying. So remember this, class, the professor concluded, his voice filled with a mixture of amusement and respect. The next time you encounter a human, don't be fooled by their unassuming appearance. Behind those beady little eyes and that questionable posture lies a being capable of incredible feats of endurance, astonishing creativity, and a stubborn refusal to accept the limitations of their own biology. They are walking, talking medical marvels, and studying them is a reminder that in this vast, weird universe of ours, anything is possible. As the students began to gather their things or coalesce their forms depending on their particular physiology, Zyx'nax couldn't help but add one final quip. Oh, and if a human ever offers you something called coffee, do yourself a favor and politely decline. Trust me on this one, some aspects of human biochemistry are best left unexperienced. The class erupted in one final burst of laughter as they filed out of the lecture hall, each student now carrying a newfound appreciation and no small amount of bewilderment for the strange, resilient, paradoxical species known as humans. And as Zyx'nax watched them go, he couldn't help but chuckle to himself. After all these years of studying humans, they still managed to surprise him. It was almost enough to make him want to try that coffee stuff himself. Almost.